I'm sitting on the sofa, looking into the soft glow of the fireplace, a glass of eggnog in my hand. It's Christmas Eve, and in the background, I can hear my wife humming a carol in harmony with the soft tunes coming from the stereo as she sets out the Santa Claus gifts. Even though our children are all but grown now, we still have Santa on Christmas morning. Only instead of dolls and toys, the gifts are sweaters and dresses, movies and CDs, but they are still given with the love that they have come to expect from us. I look over at her, and as it happens so often, she looks back at the same moment. Our eyes lock, and we smile at each other with the look of love everlasting. I think back then to an earlier Christmas Eve many years ago, and to one 2 years before that, when a series of circumstances, fortunate and unfortunate, led Grace to become my lover, and soon thereafter, my wife. They say you sometimes have to go through hell to get to heaven. And that was true in my case. I went through a hell that I wouldn't wish on any man. But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have Grace, and I wouldn't be half the man I am today. Let me tell you my story because there are some lessons to be learned from it. To the best of my knowledge, in the history of the world, there has only been one perfect man, and even he was quite a bit more than just a man. So it stands to reason then that every one of us, at some point in our lives, has done something bad, something that hurts someone else. We've all done something that should have earned us condemnation, at least from the higher powers, and it is because of grace that we don't pay the penalty for our often stupid decisions. In my case, I took someone who was straight, or at least drug-free, and started her on the path to addiction. I introduced Elise Tucker to marijuana when we were just out of high school, and from that one corrupting moment, she slowly descended into the world of junkies and prostitution. It might not have been so bad, except that not long after that, I got her pregnant, we got married, and she eventually gave me 3 children in the space of 4 years, 2 daughters, and a son. It wasn't until we'd been married almost 8 years that I realized what she'd become, behind my back and under my nose, and it took most of my money and all of my self-respect before I was finally free of her. And even then, she left me with scars, physical and emotional, that I still have to this day. My name is Steve Moreland, and I'm 42, far wiser than I was when I was 15. I was born and raised in a suburban area near a mid-sized southern city. My folks were fairly well off, and I did my damnedest to be cool. Although I was on the football team all through high school, I didn't play much, mostly on special teams and the junior varsity. That never stopped me from smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, or smoking pot. That's just the way it was in those days. You'd have thought that when a good friend of mine was killed during my senior year of high school that it would set some of us straight, and in my case it did for a while. I was on the rebound from that incident when I began dating Elise. We had a class together, and she sort of latched onto me as someone who was in need. Never mind that she already had a boyfriend, a fellow that was a year older, and going to the nearby junior college. We started dating, and soon she threw him over for me. That should have been a warning, but I was so sloppy in love that I failed to notice. At that time, Elise was kind of a band nerd, but she was a band nerd who put out, as they say. She was a little taller than average and fairly nice-looking, with a body that had all the parts in the right places and in the right proportions. She was always a little self-conscious about her nose, which did have a bit of a quirk to it, although it in no way hurt her looks, and she had soft brown hair that was utterly unremarkable. She was, for the most part, a nice girl, the youngest child of a truck driver and a schoolteacher. But there were a few folks here and there who didn't like her much, one of whom was my father. Even before she got mixed up in drugs, Elise was very moody at times, and when she was in a bad mood, she could be a bitch. But that was okay because when I was in a bad mood, I could be pretty foul too. Even my mom, who liked her and empathized with her, recognized the pitfalls of 2 people like us hooking up. I also think my dad sensed that there were demons lurking in her soul that could devour me if they were unleashed. Plus, he thought I could do a lot better. But I was in love, and besides, he'd supposedly married beneath his station as well, and my mother turned out to be a true princess of a person. The relationship might have run its course if I hadn't gone to college and come back for Thanksgiving break with a renewed appreciation for the wonders of weed. The first day I was back from college was on a Tuesday morning. Alyssa's parents were working, and she met me at the door still dressed in her thin nightgown. We hadn't been together in a couple of months, and we were hot and horny, but I talked her into throwing on some clothes and taking a ride with me. We had a really good parking spot we'd used before, and I drove us there. We got parked, and I pulled out a fat doobie. She kind of looked at me in disapproval, but I guess she'd always been a little curious about it based on the way I talked about it in roundabout terms, so she agreed to try it. She got real giggly, then she turned on me with a passion I hadn't seen in her before. I mean, we had sex before, but it always seemed like she was holding something back. Not this time. She kissed me wildly, and in seconds, we were frantically ripping at each other's clothes. Having sex in the back seat of the car is not the most comfortable experience, but it certainly was an exciting one. We were covered in sweat and laughing insanely as we slowly floated back to Earth from such an incredible high. I quickly learned that it had the same effect on Elise that it had on me. It made her insatiably horny, and we had sex every chance we got that whole weekend until I left that Sunday. We spent the whole Christmas vacation doing pretty much the same thing, although finding the time and space to have sex could be tricky. However, it wasn't all fun and games, and the longer the holiday break continued, the more friction there was. Elise was so horny and fell so quickly into the weed that I would subsequently wonder what she was doing when I was off at college. When we weren't getting stoned and having sex, we were getting a little bitchy at each other, and I think we were probably headed for the inevitable breakup when fate intervened. I'd been back at college for the spring semester about a month when Elise called me, blubbering. Her period had been late. She'd gone quietly to a clinic, and the doctor confirmed her worst fear. She was pregnant. Even though neither of us was at the time very religious, we didn't believe in abortion, and after talking about it, we decided to get married. Needless to say, both sets of parents were not happy, and my dad in particular begged me not to go through with it. But I felt like it was the manly thing, the honorable thing to do. So in May 1983, we were married. Much later, after our daughter Mary was born, I worked out the timeline, and Elise must have conceived on, or about Christmas Day. I would end up doing the same thing with the other two as well. With a wife and a family to support, college wasn't an option, and I got a job working for a drugstore as a stocker and sometime cashier. I couldn't have gotten that job under the same circumstances today, because I'd have never passed a drug screen. But that wasn't standard practice back then, and I soon showed an affinity for the job. After 2 years, I was promoted to assistant store manager at another branch in town, and in 1985, Elise gave me a son, Robert. Just a year later, we had our other girl, Allison. With that, Elise had her tubes tied, and we set about raising our family. Throughout this period, we partied pretty good, but nothing too wild. We'd smoke pot on a fairly regular basis, and occasionally we'd spring for some coke, hash, or LSD. Elise liked the way some of the drugs made her feel, and she was enthusiastic about it whenever we got high, especially since we'd have sex like rabbits when we did. But as the kids got older, the harder drugs fell away from me. Eventually, as I started getting more and more responsibility, I let it start to fade away from my life, and I thought Elise had as well. Let me emphasize that I loved her throughout all of this, even if at times things got a little tense around the house. It was in the fall of 1989, when Allison was 3 and Robert was 4, that Elise decided to go back to work. She found a job as a secretary for a modest-sized electric contractor. At first, I didn't mind because it meant added income that we needed to support a growing family. But then I started to meet some of the people she was working with, and I began to get real bad vibes, especially from the men that worked there. To be blunt about it, a lot of them were lecherous lowlifes, and a couple of them I knew to be serious druggies. And then there was Elise's friend Glenda, who worked there and who had steered Elise into the job. Glenda was married to Mitch, who was a low-level dealer and the main person we turned to when we wanted to get fixed up. They fought constantly and ran around on each other all the time. I even think they did some swinging, although I never got involved in that. Mitch was okay for the most part, unless he got deep into the whiskey. Then he could be a real terror, so I didn't get too close to him. But Elise and Glenda became fast friends, so we spent a lot of time at their house. The first time I really thought something might be going on with Elise was that New Year's Eve. We went to a big party at Mitch and Glenda's, and it was the usual year-end bash. A lot of beer and a lot of smoke. I had been away from the weed for about 6 weeks, so it hit me pretty hard. Still, I was all right until just after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I sucked down the better part of a bottle, on top of a dozen or so beers, and I got sick as a dog. I remember sitting on the driveway in a drunken stupor, and it was cold out that night. Elise finally found me after I'd been out there heaving my guts out, and brought me in and laid me on a bed where I passed out. I must have been down for a couple of hours when one of their teenage daughters rustled me out of her room. I kind of staggered into the den looking for my wife, but she was nowhere in sight. I thought I heard muffled sounds of intimacy from one of the back bedrooms, but I was too out of it to do anything about it. The next thing I knew, it was morning. I was on the floor in their den, and Elise was asleep on the sofa. After that night, I made a vow that I was never going to do anything like that again. I had a good career going, and I could sense that things in society were trending away from an acceptance of recreational drug use. It was the just say no era as the stories about the pitfalls of illegal drug use began to circulate. I cut down my drinking considerably and all but gave up smoking pot. I quit keeping it around and over the next year weaned myself away from it altogether. I really thought Elise was in it with me, but it began to become clear to me that she'd simply quit using at home. The first real sign that things were changing came in the spring. Elise went to get her hair cut one day and came back as a blonde. I also noticed that she was losing some of the weight she put on having the children, although I didn't see her on any diet or workout program that would cause weight loss. With her weight loss and her new hair color, which I didn't care for, she began to sport a new, more revealing wardrobe. When I finally complained about it, she just shrugged and said something about wanting to look good. But at work, it didn't add up. As spring turned to summer, she began going out with the girls a couple of nights a week after work, and she started coming in later and later. After many of her nights out, she tried to slip in quietly, lock herself in the bathroom, and shower. And as she was going out and staying out, our sex life simply ceased to exist. At the time, it concerned me. Later, I'd be glad it had. It was in mid-July when she came home around 2 in the morning, and I watched her while pretending to be asleep. I watched her pull her dress off, and I was shocked to realize that she'd been naked under her dress. That was the first concrete sign that really made me suspect that she was cheating on me. I confronted her about it the next morning, and she looked me straight in the eye and denied it. "Of course, I'm not having an affair," she said indignantly. "Are you?" "Not even close," I answered back. But her attitude spoke volumes. She was taking the offended approach and turning my suspicions into her suspicions. I knew I'd stayed faithful, even though I had periodically been offered by some of the girls who worked under me. I knew that was a bad practice to get into, and I avoided those encounters. It wasn't that I was so virtuous that I wouldn't have sex with another woman outside of my marriage if I got the chance. It had more to do with my personality. I've never been blessed with the gift of gab, and I never learned how to smooth-talk strange women. I was in my comfort zone with Elise, and trying to step out with other women would have been hard for me to do. At home, our attitudes toward each other blew hot and cold. But as time went on, there was more and more of a disconnect between us. Our sex life was a joke, and we weren't having the kind of playful banter we'd had earlier in the marriage. I also began to harp on it when she'd come home just a little bit late, but with the telltale bloodshot eyes and sweet aroma of marijuana about her. Again, she turned it back on me, telling me in no uncertain terms that she was old enough to do what she wanted, that I was the one who had started her down that road, and if I wasn't willing to party with her, she'd find someone who would. Around the end of September, I made a desperate effort to salvage our relationship. I caught Elise on a day when she was off, had her sit down, and we talked. I told her I knew she was smoking pot a lot heavier than she ever had before, and I told her I suspected she was using harder drugs as well. I asked her if she still loved me, and if she still wanted to be married to me. She looked at me tearfully and said she did. "Okay then. I have a few conditions," I said. "I want you to quit that job and find something else. I'd like to see you get into a rehab program, and we need to see a marriage counselor. I'm willing to wipe the slate clean, but only if you're willing to meet me halfway." "I don't know, Steve," she said. "I make good money there, and I like working there. They treat me nice, and I'm definitely not going into any rehab. I understand if you don't want to do it anymore, but I'm not ready to quit. I'm not a junkie or anything. I can handle it." She did agree to meet with a counselor, and we went twice. Then she decided that it was a waste of time and money we didn't have, and she quit going, and the pattern of wayward behavior resumed. I started following her around to the bars she'd go to after work. She'd drink with a mixed group of men and women, and some of the places she was going were pretty seedy. I never stayed long enough to see if she went off to motels or anything, because I had to get home to see to the children. But a couple of times, I saw her walk to the back of the bar, toward the restrooms, and stay back there a lot longer than I thought was necessary for her to do whatever business it is that women do in the ladies' room. By December, I had enough circumstantial evidence that I was prepared to take the next step and get concrete proof. By then, our marriage was a joke. We were fighting constantly, and she was coming home late from work just about every other night, looking like she'd been rode hard. I was fed up with Elise, and what I could see was her pattern of lies and infidelities. More than that, she had really shirked the role of mother, as she spent her time running around partying all the time. I was doing most of the parenting because she didn't have time for the children, and don't think they didn't notice. I needed to know what she was doing so I could plan my next move, whether there was any hope of saving our marriage or whether it was time for a divorce. I did 3 things to begin. First, I went to my doctor, ostensibly for a checkup, and while I was there, I asked for a blood test. I wanted to establish 2 things. One, that I didn't have any sexually transmitted diseases, and second, I wanted to show that I was now drug-free. Next, I quietly got samples from all 3 of our children and sent them to a DNA lab in another state. I wanted rock-solid proof, one way or another, that I was or was not the father of my children. DNA testing was not quite as sophisticated then as it is now, but it was advanced enough to tell me whether I was really the father of the children I'd been raising. I didn't think it would make a difference in my feelings for them. I was their daddy, regardless of whether I was really their father. But from a legal standpoint, I had to know one way or the other. If we got divorced, I was going for custody, and my chances would be a lot better if I was their biological father. Finally, I asked around and got the name of the best divorce attorney in town, then went to see him. I laid out my concerns, and he agreed to take me on as a client and referred me to his private investigator. Lily Spradling was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s whom I would soon learn knew everybody in town and everything about them. I told her what I wanted, and she took on my case. It was already starting to cost me an arm and a leg, and I still didn't know anything concrete. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. It was the custom of her company to close up the shop around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Eve and invite all of the employees to a big party in their warehouse. I figured that Elise would party for a couple of hours, then come home so we could do some last-minute shopping. then get the Santa Claus stuff ready for the kids, so it would be waiting when they got up at the crack of dawn on Christmas. But 6 o'clock came and went, and no Elise. Then 9 o'clock passed with no sign of her. I started calling everywhere I could think of. Glenda, who was also out of pocket, the jails, hospitals, and she was nowhere to be found. I was livid. She didn't even have the decency to curb her antics on Christmas Eve. I was still up waiting for her around 10:30 when I heard a car door slam, and I saw my wife stumbling up the walk to the house. She saw me standing there, and I was shocked. Her face just fell, and she tried to push past me, but I caught her, and I was overwhelmed by the smell. She reeked of sweat, and you can imagine. Hell, she even had some of it dried in her hair, and her eyes were completely unfocused, like she'd spent a hard day getting high. I stared at her, and she averted her gaze. Then something inside me just collapsed. At that moment, I was just too tired to fight her. Besides, I would soon have a video record of her entire day, because I'd had a feeling she'd do something like that. So I had Lily set up surveillance. By then, Lily had discovered that Elise had been identified as a woman who frequented a seedy motel on the rough side of town in the company of some rough-looking characters. Lily had bribed a clerk at the motel, and she had been allowed to plant a hidden camera in one of the rooms, with the understanding that if Elise showed up, she and whoever she was with would be steered to that room. Elise and I spent a tense Christmas day circling each other while I waited for the bomb to drop. It was the calm before the storm. I knew Elise was off work for the next week. They always closed up for the week between Christmas and New Year's, so I wasn't as worried about what she'd be doing. The day after Christmas, Lily called me at the store, and her voice sounded urgent. "You need to come see the tape from the other day," she said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Worse than anything you can imagine," she said. Now, I figured Elise had a boyfriend, maybe two, but I was not prepared at all for what I saw on Lily's surveillance tape. Lily had me sit down in the empty office of one of her associates, plugged the tape into the VCR, and left me alone to digest what was on the tape. Before she started the tape, she handed me a surveillance report chronicling Elise's behavior before she arrived at the motel. That really was all the evidence I needed because it was pretty graphic in itself. I don't know how Lily did it, but she had somehow gotten her associate into the company's party, and he had eyewitness accounts of what went on. It started off as a conventional party, lots of drinking with some smooching under the mistletoe. Nothing too dramatic. After an hour, though, the Christmas carols that had been on the boombox were changed to dance music, and Elise was seen dirty dancing with several people, including her friend Glenda. According to the report, Elise and Glenda had all but had sex in the middle of the room, while the men in attendance surrounded them and cheered them on. Then it hit the fan. Elise was seen headed out to the parking lot in the company of some guy. The PI set up a post where he could see what they were doing. First, they lit up a joint, and while they were smoking it, he pulled out a vial, and they shared several spoons of coke. When they were finished, he saw Elise's head drop into the man's lap, and he could see the man's head thrown back, a look of pleasure on his face. After a few minutes, Elise's head popped back up, and she was wiping something off her mouth as she smiled wickedly. Then they returned to the party. About 5 o'clock, the party broke up, but instead of driving home, Elise followed several pickup trucks to the motel where she had been seen before. And that's where the tape started. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, entered the room in the company of 4 guys whom I describe as hard-looking. They were all around 6 feet and well-built, and a couple of them were even fairly good-looking if you like men who are a little rough-edged. 3 joints were fired up and started making the rounds while one of the men sat at a table and began drawing out several fat lines of coke. As the room filled with smoke, everybody, including Elise, took a line up each nostril, and she giggled seductively when she had done hers. Then they got down to business. What I saw on the tapes put every spicy movie I had ever heard of to shame. Her performance with all the guys was at a professional level. I'd seen enough. But I did fast forward through the tape just to get set in my mind how bad it had gotten. And it did get worse. By then, though, I was numb to any further shock. So when she took on all 4 of them at once, it just didn't really register. I guess the look on my face spoke volumes, because Lily had her associate, the one who'd tailed Elise at the party, take me to a nearby bar for a medicinal drink. After a couple of beers with Burl, short for Burlington, I felt a little better. We talked about what I planned to do, and he agreed to help me when it came time to serve Elise with divorce papers. He was a big, muscular fellow who turned out to be a softy inside, and he empathized with me. Burl had been through much the same thing as I had, and he understood what I was going through. It was all I could do to be civil to Elise that night when I went home. Luckily, I guess, she made it easy for me by getting dressed up and going out that night with her friends. I didn't even bother to watch her leave. I was playing with Allison in the den when she left. The next morning, I went to my lawyer and told him I was ready to file the papers. I wanted them ready for New Year's Eve, and I wanted Burl to be the one to serve her. I had a New Year's surprise for my soon-to-be ex-wife. For New Year's Eve, I told Elise that I was going to have to work until closing at 9 p.m., and that I'd rather just spend a quiet night at home. I begged her to stay home with me, knowing full well that she'd do nothing of the sort, which I had planned on. As always, she was planning on going to Glinda and Mitch's year-end party, and she just sort of laughed at what she thought was my pathetic attempt to guilt her into staying home. "If you want to be a stick in the mud, go right ahead," she said. "But I'm ready to partay." "Can't you at least stay long enough to keep the kids until I get home from work?" I asked. "Why?" she sneered. "Why should I let the little rugrats cut into my fun time? I'll get a sitter if you can't tear yourself away from that store in time to keep your precious little babies." I was stunned. I knew she lost interest in parenting, but the cold way she talked about the children just floored me. It would make what subsequently happened hard to fathom. "That's quite all right, Elise," I said slowly. "I'll make the arrangements. You don't have to lift a finger for your children one little bit." I called the neighbor's teenage daughter, who was the kids' regular sitter, and asked her to keep the kids for about an hour. She agreed, and I told her to call the store as soon as Elise left the house. A little after 6:30, the girl called, and I turned over the store to my assistant. I called my brother, who had agreed to meet me at the house to help pack up Elise's things. His wife drove him over and left with my children, who were told they were going to spend the night with their grandparents. We got all of Elise's belongings packed up and moved in my pickup truck to a storage facility, then drove to Mitch and Glenda's a little after 10 o'clock. Burl was sitting in his car, in a secure location, watching the house. "She hasn't left," Burl said. "It's a pretty safe bet she's there for the night." "Good," I said. As he poured me a cup of coffee from a thermos he had with him, we watched the house as several people came and went until the stroke of midnight. As the sounds of fireworks and other revelry erupted all around us, the 3 of us got out and approached the house. At first, no one answered the door, probably because they couldn't hear over the din. But Burl pounded on the door, and finally, someone I didn't know opened the door. "Elise Moreland," he boomed as we stepped into the foyer. It took a few minutes before someone could fetch her to the door, and she looked awfully wasted when she showed up. "Yeah. What?" she began. Then she saw me and my brother standing on either side of Burl, and I think our faces told her we weren't there to join the party. "What are you?" she began again, but Burl cut her off. "Elise Moreland," he said as he slapped one of the letters he had with him into her hand. "You are served. This is a petition filed in civil court by Mr. Steve Moreland, seeking divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. And this is an injunction from the court preventing you from coming within 1,500 feet of the domicile formerly occupied by you and said husband. And this envelope contains the key and the address to a storage facility where your belongings have been moved." "You sorry son of a..." Elise sputtered, and I could see Mitch, Glenda, and all of their friends starting to amass behind her. "I gave you a chance, Elise," I said evenly. "I gave you the opportunity to clean up your act, and you chose to betray me. You've made your bed. Now lie in it." We heard a cacophony of outrage building, so Burl opened his jacket, revealing the pistol in his belt. He put his hand on the handle and stared down the crowd. Then we turned and strode purposefully out of the house as the door slammed shut behind us. I doubt that Burl would have used his pistol, but it had made for a very effective peacemaker. Then I went to my folks to spend what was left of New Year's Eve and gird my loins for the battle to come. It wasn't long in coming. Truth is, Elise started stepping in her own mess right from the get-go, and it was the beginning of the year from hell. While we had been packing up her things, I'd hired a locksmith to come to our house and change the locks, but that didn't stop Elise. While we were spending New Year's Day at my parents' house, she broke a window in the kitchen door to get into the house and apparently ransacked our bedroom. Perhaps she was looking for something. I'm not sure. It didn't matter. I called the police and had her charged with breaking and entering, because it was her first arrest, and because it was done in conjunction with my serving her the night before. Her lawyer managed to get the charges dropped. A week later, I got my blood work back from the doctor and breathed a sigh of relief when everything came up negative. I added those documents to my growing evidence file, then got more good news the following week. The DNA results revealed that all 3 of the kids were indeed mine. Whatever Elise had done behind my back, she'd started doing after the babies were born. That made my strategy easy. I was going for full custody, and I was only going to allow Elise supervised visitation. To my bafflement, she fought everything tooth and nail. I'd have thought the way she'd been acting, that she'd be glad to have her freedom, that she'd welcome not having a husband and family holding her back from doing what she wanted. But I reckoned without the demons that my father had seen lurking in her heart all those years earlier. Once I established myself as the enemy in her eyes, she wasn't about to let me win anything without a fight. Yet it seemed like the more she tried to fight me, the worse things got for her, and the more infuriated she got with me. That included another arrest for possession of marijuana, which resulted in a hefty fine and got her driver's license suspended for 6 months. It took until midsummer, but I finally got the divorce I'd been seeking. Then we went to family court on the custody issue, and she brought out what she thought was her heavy artillery, the fact that I'd been the person who'd turned her on to drugs. But my lawyer brought out my evidence that I was drug-free and had been for the better part of a year. It looked like I was going to get full custody when Elise finally went too far. It was a hot night in September, and I was just leaving the store. The only warning I got was a sudden shuffling of several pairs of feet. Then I felt something, a large stick, or maybe a baseball bat, hit me hard right in my ribs. I just managed to roll away from a blow aimed at my head, which glanced off my shoulder. I managed to get up on my knees and defend myself, and I saw I was beset by 3 attackers, 2 of whom I recognized from the tape of Elise's Christmas Eve incident. I was able to engage the guy who was wielding the cudgel so that he couldn't get a real blow in on me, and I managed to land some hard blows to the guy's midsection. But the flip side was that I was left open to attack from the fists and feet of the other 2. I don't know if they'd have killed me or not, but I vaguely heard voices coming from down the street, and I was left in a painful heap. The last thing I remember was some kid hovering over me, asking me if I was all right, then calling for someone to go get help. Literally, the next thing I saw was a face, the face of a woman. At first, it was kind of vague, but as my head began to clear, I saw that she was a nurse, and a very pretty one at that. She had a fairly thin face, but she smiled when she saw I was coming around, and when she did, her whole face lit up. That was my introduction to Grace Pauling. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, during which time I got to know Grace very well. She was quite simply the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. She was very aptly named because she just had a graceful way about her, an elegance that comes from inner peace. She was a little taller than average and quite slender, with soft blonde hair cut fashionably just short of her shoulders. She was all but flat-chested, but if that bothered her at all, she didn't show it, and it sure never bothered me. From the beginning, I felt there was something there, and we'd talk while she busied herself caring for me. I found her to be a terrific listener and someone who was wise beyond her years. She was a year or so older than me, but she'd never been married, never really been close to it. She told me she'd had a few boyfriends, but none that had set her heart aflutter. Then she smiled that megawatt smile and winked at me. While I was in the hospital, I met several times with the police, and it became pretty clear that I'd been attacked at the behest of my ex-wife, for reasons that I just couldn't understand. She and her friends were arrested and charged with attempted murder. I let her sweat until the beginning of the next year. Then I met her to make a deal. If she relinquished all custody claims, I would see about getting the charges reduced to aggravated assault. "Why should I help you?" she snarled. "Because I really don't think you want to spend the next 15 years in prison," I said. "I'm giving you the choice between 3 to 6 years and the possibility of occasionally seeing your children as opposed to 15 to life, and never seeing them again. Don't be as foolish as you were when you rejected my offer to save our marriage. Remember, I'd have overlooked all the stuff you'd done up to that point if you'd done what I asked. If you'd quit that job, gone into rehab, been serious about counseling, none of this would have happened. But you declined, and where did it get you? You're unemployed, you're still struggling with your issues, and now you're about to become a convicted felon." "You haven't got anything on me," she said. "Oh," I said, and this time I sneered at her. I was through being Elise's doormat. "You should hear the story your friends are telling," I said. "They're saying you hired them to beat me up. They're telling the cops that you wanted me dead. They're rolling over on you, Elise, and the only chance you have is to cut a deal." I could see her shoulders slump at that. In the end, she gave it up and did make a deal with the DA to plead guilty to aggravated assault. She went off for a term of 3 to 6 years, and I was finally rid of her for all intents and purposes. But it had left me financially drained and emotionally wasted. I was forced to sell the house and moved back to my parents' home with the 3 kids. My mom was a godsend, helping take care of the children and trying her best to ease their fears. After getting out of the hospital, I had another 2 months of rehab, during which time I couldn't work. I was on company insurance, plus I got workers' comp, but the Christmas season was approaching, and they needed a store manager on site. Compared to the fiasco of the previous year, Christmas in 1991 was significantly better, and yet it drove home for me just how lonely I was. The woman I'd thought I'd loved, the mother of my children, had become a sworn enemy and had made a complete wreck of her life. Money was tight, so I wasn't really able to do for the kids like I wanted. I was still in some pain and sinking into depression over the way things had gone the previous 18 months. And then it got worse. After the first of the year, the company I'd been working for gave me a choice. I could take a manager's position in another state, or I could accept a layoff. I did neither. I tendered my resignation and found a job working the floor for a large retail store. It was a significant come-down from a manager's position, and I made quite a bit less than I had before. Basically, it was like starting over in my career, but it was easy work, and the hours suited me because they allowed me to be home in the evenings with my children. I rented a small house, and we moved out of my parents' house. It was in a fairly low-rent neighborhood, and there wasn't much to call it home. All in all, that winter of 1992 was the lowest point of my life. The only good thing about it was that I resisted the siren call of drugs and alcohol. After seeing Elise's self-destruction, I knew better than to go that route, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't ever tempted. Then an angel crossed my path for the second time. It was on a Saturday. I was in the grocery store with the kids, and they were being a handful. By this time, they were 8, 6, and 5, and while they were good kids, they were kids. I was fussing with Robert, who was really acting out, when I heard a voice from behind me. Steve Moreland," I heard. I turned to see Grace coming over to where we were. We hugged, and then she dropped down and greeted all three of the children by name. I was amazed. She'd only met them once or twice, and yet she knew their names and how old they were. That was the first time I saw just how gifted she was with children, because they calmed right down. We chatted, and she seemed real concerned about how I was doing. Then we sort of looked up at the same time, and our eyes locked. It was just for a moment, but I think in that one moment we knew the spark was there. "Look, would you like to go to dinner sometime?" I said hesitantly. "Heck, I owe you for all the care you showed me when I was hospitalized." "Steve, I was just doing my job," Grace said. "But I have to say it was a pleasure, and I'd love to go out with you. You have any plans for tonight?" I just stared at her. Later, when I got to know her better, I learned that was her way. She's very direct, and she knows how to cut to the chase without going through a bunch of nonsense. Anyway, we exchanged phone numbers. Then she gave me a little kiss on the cheek. It was nothing, really, but it sent goosebumps all over my body, and my little Allison picked up on it right away. As we were finishing our shopping, she just blurted it out. "Is she going to be our new mommy?" she asked me. "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart," I said. "It's way too early to say." "Why? Would you like for her to be your new mommy?" "Oh, yes," she said happily. "What about you guys?" I asked Mary and Robert. "You think you could accept Miss Grace as your new mommy?" "Sure, Dad," Robert said. "She's pretty neat." "We'll see then," I laughed. "But it's awfully early, and she may have something to say about it." "But you do like her, don't you, Daddy?" Mary said in her typical quiet, introspective voice. "Yeah, I do," I said. "But like I said, we've got a long way to go before we get to that point." That night, I took Grace to a steakhouse. Nothing fancy, but a place with a good atmosphere and good food. And I learned that she was everything Elise was not. I can't say she's perfect because she does have her moments, but I've never met anyone with a sunnier disposition, never been around someone who has such a positive outlook on life. With Elise, doom and gloom were right around every corner, and she spent endless amounts of energy worrying about things she had no control over, things that were over and done. She was so filled with regret and remorse that it always tended to drag me down. With Grace, every day is a new opportunity. She is a forward-looking person, a planner, someone who is well organized, and she never wastes a minute worrying about the past. Once the day is over, she puts it behind her and only refers to it if she absolutely must. It didn't take long before we knew we were falling fast in love. After we'd been dating about 6 weeks, I took her to meet my family, and they were very impressed. My father, in fact, took one look at her and told me to do whatever I needed to do to keep her. The kids, of course, fell in love with Grace almost as quickly as I did, and she fell right into the surrogate mother role. As the summer progressed, we started getting intimate, but we both shied away from sex, at least initially. After my experience with Elise, I was afraid of letting myself go with a woman, afraid to let my feelings loose, and she was simply not someone who engaged in casual sex. "When I make love with you, I want it to be the sealing of a bond of love," she told me one night as we were sitting on the sofa in my house after she'd come over for dinner, the way she had been for months. It was mid-November, and we were starting to talk vaguely about a life together. "I love you, Steve, but I don't want you to do this until you're ready. Until we're both ready for this to be a long-term commitment," she went on. "I gave my virginity away a long time ago, in college, to a guy I thought I was in love with, and he broke my heart. Since then, I've waited for the right man. I think you're that man. But until you're ready to take that last step, to walk in faith with me, then it's not going to happen. God, Grace, I do want you so badly, but you don't know how good it makes me feel to hear you say that," I said. After what I went through with Elise, to hear a woman equate sex with love is music to my ears. "Soon, my love," she whispered. Then she kissed me slowly and deeply. A week or so later, I went to my mother and told her I was going to ask Grace to marry me. And she did something she'd never done for Elise, I guess because of the forced nature of our marriage. She went to her bedroom, to her jewelry box, and pulled out her old engagement ring. She handed it to me with tears in her eyes. "Give this to her with my blessing," she said. "It's not a big fancy diamond, just a small stone in a common setting. But I have a feeling with her it will mean far more than some shiny new bauble that'll cost you an arm and a leg. There's an awful lot of love in this ring, and I want her to have it. She's the best thing that's ever happened to you, and I want her to know it." I decided to wait until Christmas Eve to make my pitch. I had decided that we'd do Santa Claus at my folks' house, where they would have their stuff with their cousins and grandparents. And two, I wanted to be alone with Grace that night. I picked her up at the hospital after I got off work, then went to my folks to pick up the kids for Christmas Eve service at the church, where Grace had long been a member and where I'd started going. Grace sang in the choir, and I stared lovingly into her eyes as they sang. Later, we managed to get the kids down. It wasn't easy, but then we set out the Santa gifts. Once that was done, I told my folks that we were going back to my house, and I winked at my mom, communicating my plans non-verbally. I turned on the lights on the Christmas tree and put some holiday tunes on the stereo. Then we sat down on the sofa together, and I eased the box from where I'd hidden it in the cushions. "Grace, I have a special Christmas gift for you, and I want you to open it now," I said softly. I handed the box to her, and when she opened it, her eyes got wide, and her mouth fell open in delighted surprise. "Grace, will you marry me?" Her answer was to smother me with kisses. Our hands were roaming all over each other, and this time we didn't stop. Our time had arrived. "God, I've wanted this for so long. Love me, Steve, please. Believe me, I've wanted it just as long. Longer. Really." We made love. Once done, I stared into her eyes, and she stared back, the feelings flowing wordlessly between us. "Merry Christmas," she whispered. "Merry Christmas to you, love," I answered back. Grace and I were married in our church in mid-March, and we've enjoyed almost 14 years now of wedded bliss. My children soon became hers, at least in her heart at first, and they took to their new mommy like ducks to water. There have only been 2 dark clouds on our life together since then. One is the fact that Grace was unable to give me a child of her own. We tried like the Dickens, and we finally learned that there was a problem with her uterus. Typically, Grace never dwelled on her misfortune and concentrated on helping me raise the children we had. The second came after we'd been married about 6 years. I got a call out of the blue from Elise, and she told me that she contracted HIV several years earlier, and now she was dying of AIDS. She'd gotten out of prison after 3+ years and ended up on the street, turning tricks. She was in a hospice and wanted to see her children before she passed. I dreaded the visit, but oddly enough, Elise had made peace with herself and with me. She no longer blamed me for all of the bad things that had happened to her over the course of her life. She forgave me for the mistakes I'd made during our marriage, and I forgave her for the hell she put me through in the process of our divorce. After meeting with the kids, she asked to speak to Grace alone, and when she came out, Grace was in tears. Later, as we were driving home, she told me a little of what they'd talked about. "She told me not to let you go," she said. "She told me the worst mistake she ever made was not listening to you when you offered to look past her misdeeds and save the marriage. You gave her a chance, and she knows she blew it by turning her back on you. I think that's why she was so bitter about the divorce." The last thing Elise did before she died was consent for Grace to adopt the children. She'd resisted it through all of her hard, bitter years after the divorce, but in the end, she did the right thing and gave the love of my life the opportunity to truly be a mother. With Grace by my side, I quickly got back into management and rose into the ranks of the corporate office. I'm a regional director for the company I work for, and I've done well. Grace is still a nurse, working in pediatrics, an area where her special gifts are most needed. Sometimes, the cases she deals with break her heart, and others inflame her outrage. She does have a temper, although she keeps it well hidden. Mary was so taken with her stepmother that she chose to follow in her footsteps and pursue a career in nursing. Robert is still in college and joined the Army National Guard right out of high school. I worry that the longer the war in Iraq drags on, he may be called up, but that's his choice, and I support him all the way. Likewise, Allison is in college, with an eye toward becoming a teacher. It's been a satisfying life, one I don't think I'd have had if Grace hadn't come into my life when she did. Santa Claus is all set out, and Grace sits on the sofa next to me, curling up into the comfort of my arms. Bing Crosby softly croons "White Christmas" from the stereo, and we gaze into the slowly banking fire as I take a final sip of my glass and set it on the coffee table. Tomorrow, there will be laughter and excitement as my family shares the gifts we've all gotten for each other. We'll tear open the packages, marvel at the thought that went into each gift, then we'll congregate in the kitchen as we prepare the holiday feast. It will be a joyous time, as always. But tonight, in the quiet of the Christmas Eve night, I enjoy the greatest gift I've ever gotten, the one that keeps on giving. Tonight, I bask in the soft glow from the love and devotion of a good woman, and in the corresponding love and commitment I've been able to show her over time. Grace is another word for elegance and an unearned gift from God, and that's certainly what my grace means to me. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.